Hi, Robin. How are you today?
David, I'm very excited to be here. I'm very well. Thank you for asking.
Where does this podcast find you today?
So, I live actually in a small community called Peterborough, Ontario. So, I'm about an hour and a half northeast of Toronto, and that's where I get to call home.
I grew up south of Rochester, New York.
Practically neighbors.
You got the better weather. I got the crappy weather.
The lake effect snow tends to go down. And yes, I get to live in cottage country up here. And I'm very appreciative to be in Peterborough with my family. And yeah, we're enjoying the good weather right now.
Lovely. Tell us about your work and resiliency.
So, I've been studying human resiliency and performance for nearly 20 years in a university setting. And one of the things that I got really curious about, David, is how do we make resiliency more accessible? It's part of our lived experience, it's part of the human condition. Yet, what I found is a lot of misconceptions about what it means to be resilient were pretty rampant. So, part of what I do is try to make it so that way we can see those components of everyday resiliency that are going to help carry the hard parts of our lives better.
And based on your research, what are you seeing as sort of the core tenets that makes someone resilient?
So, just for kind of context setting, when I first started this area of research, a lot of folks were talking about like mental toughness and grit, that resiliency was reserved for the people who were like hardy enough. And when I got to go out into the world, even and work with people all over the planet and meet some of the most resilient persons with these beautiful stories, and I would ask them about their grit and their toughness, what I would hear back were things like, Robin, I'm not very resilient. I don't feel very tough or very strong. Yet they were able to manage these really complex lives and difficult seasons. So then I went back into the research to figure out, okay, well, who suggested it's about grit and toughness? And at the time, a lot of the comparators that they were using to measure human resilience, there was one particular control group. And that was actually Navy SEALs. So they were like comparing all of us to Navy SEALs to see like how tough we were. So when we realized that this was actually not a real, not really a valid measuring stick, given what we face each and every day, we went back into that work and we started to see some themes and we clustered them together, David, into 5 key areas. And that's what we often talk about in my work on everyday resiliency.
Before we get into what those are,
Yeah.
could you define resiliency for us non-Navy SEALs?
I love that. So essentially the like textbook definition of resiliency is how do we build a comeback? How do we bounce back from some type of adversity, a setback, or some type of a disappointment? So we were on a trajectory, we get knocked off that trajectory. How do we pick ourselves back up? Now that's usually that traditional definition. In my work on resiliency, I also hold that space of how do we bounce back? How do we build a comeback? But I'm also curious on how do we proactively cope ahead of time so that way when that adversity strikes, we're well resourced and we're well equipped. So the fall doesn't have to be as far. So I look at it both reactively, how do we bounce back, but also how do we set ourselves up in the future to make sure that we can weather what comes our way.
So let's go into that. Talk to me a little bit about the core tenets of resiliency that you found in your research.
Yeah, so we identified 5, which were these areas of that commonality we saw across people. And again, this was all through like North America, the Middle East, like it was a broad group. Now, the first one was a sense of belonging, that people actually need a home team. You need that one consistent, caring person that holds the line with you. And what we learned about that, for some, it could be your family system, but for others, especially for our younger group, it could be a teacher, a coach, it could be a community member. It's this one person that doesn't let you give up on yourself, that sees your potential and like holds the line for you. So that sense of belonging, having your person in your corner is absolutely key. And even to the point, David, where that one caring person can often offer this like hedge of protection around you from some of the traditional stressors that we experience in our lives. So belonging was number 1. Number 2 was perspective, this ability to be able to like see our way through the world, but also feel our way through the world. That idea of like problem solving, critical thinking, but also like value aligned living, that we are able to make what matters most matter most, like keeping an eye on what matters most and showing up that way. The third area we learned about was the power of acceptance. And the reality by nature as humans, we don't really care for acceptance. We don't like what we don't like. Yet, there's an enormous amounts of power that happens when we learn how to work within our controllables and things that are within our control versus putting our energy on things that are outside of our control. The two others that we talked about was the power of hope, choosing to live hope filled, having strategies and practices that actually hold the line of our morale. And the last one was a wee bit of a wild card. We actually learned it was humor. And resilient people tend to be pretty funny, yet it's a bit of sometimes a dark humor. Yet we learned that there was a biological benefit, for example, of being able to hold space in these little micro moments of relief, especially when we're in really heavy, difficult times. So together, those 4 and 5 with that extra little wild card creates this constellation of what it looks like each and every day to be our most resilient self.
I believe it was Viktor Frankl in the ultimate book on resilience, Man's Search for Meaning. Unbelievable story. He has a line in there about humor, doesn't he?
He does, yes. And Man's Search for Meaning is by far one of the most transformational texts that I ever read. I remember reading it when I was 16 years old in a very, very dark season in my own life. That book served as like this lighthouse. It was like this guidepost for me. And there's so many things that Dr. Viktor Frankl writes about. And just at the end of the day, he talks about that role of humor. It's just this little micro moment of reprieve that we can get. So it's pretty special.
My recollection, and you'll know more about this than I do, but that back before there was Frankl, there was Freud and there was Adler, I think. And so you had these two different self-actualization. Was that Maslow?
Maslow was the actualization. Yeah. Adler was like, he's really curious about, again, there's lots of different components of it. But yeah, at the time, when we think about where Frankl was and just that ecosystem of what the thought leaders in psychology, like it was pretty dark what people
Yeah.
were thinking about. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah. And then suddenly it's really about meaning.
Yes.
Not to throw any shade on Mr. Freud, but I'll go with the meaning.
Yeah. I appreciate that. And you know what? Freud radically transformed the field of psychology and psychiatry, and it created a pathway for so many people to come up behind to look at it in a different way. So, but we're still talking about him, so we must have done something right.
Indeed. I want to get a little more granular on some of the
Yes.
things you mentioned there. So this idea of perspective and values and this sort of intersection of values, I would guess, lead to purpose. And then if you're more purposeful, you're more resilient. Is it, I get that right?
Yes, absolutely.
How does one discern things like people are often like, how do I know what my values are? And the big question, like, what is my purpose? Like, how do we discern that so that we can stay more resilient?
Yeah, you're asking really amazing questions. And I think the first about, the pressure we put on ourselves to be able to, figure out what our purpose is. I think the kind of first starting point there is to recognize that I don't think in our lifetimes it's only a one purpose. I think there's a different purpose in different seasons of our life. And it's this evolution of ourselves and our character. And, our perspective grows in relation to our lived experience. The more experiences we have, the more our perspective will grow. And when we add into that piece about meaning making and purpose filled living, the reality by our nature is we're meaning makers. We want to put meaning behind things, which is why when we're going through such a hard season or a difficult experience, the first question we ask is like, why is this happening to me? Like what's going on? And, we're looking at all these external kind of forces to try and make sense of it. Because when we have this ability to make sense of something, then we're able to reconcile that, there's going to be a way to manage it. Yet when we think about the role of living value-based living, it's deep, it's kind of tying in, David, to those really core competencies of like our character, right? The things that are within our control, the things that are steadfast over our lifetime, those value-based living tools, knowing what, and one of the things I often say to even my own teenagers, like I have 3 teenagers, and I talk about this, one of the greatest things that we can learn about ourselves is figuring out like who we are and who we are not. Right. And I think, again, just trying to figure out like, what am I all about and where can I use my skills and my talents and my gifts and where do they flow with the most ease usually gives us a pretty good indicator of where our purpose is, because I think we all have skills and tools and gifts and talents that we can share with the world for the greater good.
I think that it can sort of be simplified down into like know thyself,
Yes.
which
Yeah.
easier said than done, but
Yeah.
that's the mission of a lifetime, right?
Yeah. And, often it's like, I find sometimes kind of knowing who you aren't is actually
Yeah,
easier to explore, right? So
right.
even something on a micro level of like, I am somebody like who would not leave a grocery cart in the middle of a parking lot. That's
Mhm.
not me, right? Like it doesn't have to be these deep philosophical kind of, big mind trips that we put ourselves in sometimes trying to find this meaning and the purpose. Sometimes just getting this idea. And I'll share with you one of my kind of newer tools that I use that I love is asking people like, we often talk about our best self, right? Like, who is your best self? And the question I love to ask people I work with, and I work with teams and groups all over the world, is like, who's your favorite self? What does your favorite self look like? And when people talk about their favorite self, it just like opens this beautiful kind of pathway into their values and, how they show up, and it's energizing. So asking, people to spend some time with, when do you feel like not your best? Because I think the world tells us this checklist of this is what your best self will look like. But asking yourself, like, what's your favorite self? What are you doing? Who's around you? Why does it feel so good? Is actually pretty helpful to do some of that good work as well.
I love that. Can I use that?
You are so welcome to. And David, I want to know, like, you ask yourself, what's my favorite self? What's David doing? Right? It's a
I
fun
just,
question to play with.
exactly. If I ask myself what's my favorite self, that's when I'm acting in alignment with whatever
Yeah,
my values and purpose are. Even if I don't know what they are, I'm
exactly.
able to know I like myself when I'm doing this. That's brilliant.
And it absolutely kind of unarms that inner critic
Right.
that is like all like that negative self-talk and that like self-deprecating, which a lot of us have been conditioned and groomed to do. And I know, for example, like with my favorite self, it's like there's just no worries, right? Like she's carefree, I'm funny, right? Like I'm just enjoying the moment, I'm present. Again, all of those things will help me kind of drill down into like what are those core competencies. And again, there's for me, it comes down to trust. So when I'm deeply aligned in trust, then the worrying doesn't take up so much space, especially our mental real estate.
So trust brings me to optimism
It does.
and hope, which I guess is sort of the
Yeah.
same thing. And in what I've seen, optimistic people tend to take better care of them. Although I will say there is a group of pessimists who act in face of their pessimism. I'll call them belligerent pessimists.
Yeah.
Having this sense of optimism seems to be a huge plus for resilience and living a better life. But how would you help someone who's maybe not feeling so trusting or hopeful or optimistic? What are the strategies you would use to help elevate that?
Yeah. So I think what we start with is just that piece about building some self awareness and not meeting it with any type of criticism, but meeting it with curiosity.
Mm.
So, for example, when somebody is really under resourced and perhaps they're in that place of distress or chronic stress cycling, which I see often in my work, like these are people that are like overworked and under rested and they're just like raw, right? When you're in that space, when you're very depleted, it is much more difficult to hold the line of optimism, choosing to live a hope filled life when you're being crushed by the weight of your world. So, what we want to do first and foremost, if we want to cultivate more spaciousness for hope, what we really want to do is soothe that nervous system. So, our nervous system is designed to keep us alive. It's our first line of defense. We want to be able to notice threats, to see triggers. Like we want to be able to be aware of our surroundings. But we also want to make sure that that nervous system gets a wee bit of a rest, that there's things that we can do that can soothe it. And the more that we're able to soothe the nervous system, we'll have more spaciousness for that hope practice, or again, it could be a faith practice, that trusting practice. It will give it more place for it to grow and to strengthen. And my one little kind of note that I do with folks that I just to kind of put a cautionary note out there is there's this pressure with this like toxic positivity that I'm seeing right now, where it's like the building's on fire and they're like, it's fine. It's going to be fine. I'm fine. It's like, no, it's not fine. You need to leave the building. So I think there's just this awareness piece that is absolutely crucial, that we ensure that we are being honest with what our lived experience is, and then looking at how do I create space, or who do I find that I do better around? What type of environments, what type of habits and practices make it so there's more space to hold hope, because hope is a strategy.
And we have agency. We can take
Yeah,
action. Like we
absolutely.
don't have to stay in the burning building. We
No.
can leave.
Yes.
Yeah. I've noticed, yeah, agree that this idea that these platitudes that you see out there of you can do blah, blah, blah. Okay, well, maybe, but let's take into account our situations
Yeah.
and ratchet up or down according to that.
Yeah. David, in my book, I didn't mean to do such a tongue-in-cheek comment, but I made a comment in one of my books that said, like, motivational quotes don't work unless you do, right?
Yeah.
Like, it's one of
Oh,
those things where we can just pepper ourselves with this inspiration, motivation, but if we don't action it, it doesn't go anywhere.
yeah. My favorite example of this is Nancy Reagan. The refrigerator magnets don't do drugs.
Yeah,
Yeah, that worked great.
exactly.
Thanks, Nancy.
Yeah.
There's a line that I read that you wrote. It says that we are stronger, braver, and more capable than we ever imagined. I love this. I'm in total alignment with the statement.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about what your thinking is on this, where you're coming from.
Yeah, the reality is I feel like so many of us we do such a disservice to our greatness and to our excellence. And it's so interesting because people talk to me all this time about, like, what's holding people back is their kind of fear of failure, their fear of rejection, their fear of like trying and it not working out. And like, yeah, there's a place for that. What I see though more often is people are afraid of their greatness. People are so afraid to stand within their power, have really great things happen, have really, wishing for great things. I often just think back about the fact that, like, if we actually were to live and work within our own potential and watch ourselves evolve, we will be in such a better position to be able to be of service to others. Like, we will be the remedy and the antidote to a lot of the problems we're seeing in communities right now, when we actually step up and see that we're better equipped than most of us give ourselves credit for. And again, that negative critic, that self-talk, that idea of wanting to stay small so nobody's going to take us out, like, it's pretty strong how people are afraid of their greatness, or even just the notion of saying, I want to be like the absolute best mother my kids will ever have in their lifetime, right? Like, I want to be famous in my own family when it comes to my kids, that I am irreplaceable to my kids. Now, some people say to me, like, wow, is that about you? It's like, well, it's not really about me. It's about what I think my kids deserve and how I want to take care of myself, so that I'm able to be the best parent, caregiver, supporter, champion, guardian for those kids.
And do you feel that this not wanting to strive for really the best of who we are, for not wanting to become that excellence that we all have, is this wired in sort of human negativity bias we have towards everything?
It's a really good question. I think there's lots of different kind of ways to think about it. I think the first one is that, we want to be accepted by the group, right? From an evolutionary perspective, we want to be accepted by the group. So we want to fit in. Yet what we know and what we see in the research on resiliency, there's a difference between fitting in and belonging. Like, when we feel a deep sense of belonging, we will take risks. We will really strive for greatness, and we'll feel safe enough to do it because we have those people around us. If we're just trying to fit in, and that's something I'm seeing right now in so many different facets, whether it be professionally or personally, like, people are just desperate to be accepted and fit in with groups. That I think is one of the things that holds a lot of us back. We don't want to rock the boat. We want to be included in the group right now.
As people get older, they seem, allegedly, claim that they don't care that much about what people say about them. So they're willing to not fit in.
Yeah.
They're willing to take, oftentimes intellectual risks that someone who's younger maybe wouldn't. Talk to me about that.
Yeah, again, there's kind of two threads to pull there. I think the first is that we become, quote, braver when we're better resourced. So when we have a little bit of financial security, when we have like a little bit of, kind of skin in the game, we're able to take more risks. Like, if you're a new to career or a young professional, like, you are going to be walking that line because you want to build that security and that safety within your profession. Or if you're new in a relationship, you're going to be on your kind of best behavior because you want to be able to cultivate and build something. But as we are better resourced, we actually are braver because there's a lot of privilege that happens when we are in that position where we can meet our needs. So I think that's one area. The other area is that I think we start to have enough lessons learned, like hard earned wisdom, when we realize the opinions of others don't pay our mortgage, right? Like the opinions of other people do not make or break my experience. So I think we learn that wisdom and that ability of, like, again, knowing how to make what matters most, whose opinions matter. If somebody's opinion of us could pay our mortgage, like, yeah, we're going to listen to them. If not, we learn really quickly eventually that no, that's not, it doesn't have as much value. So we become braver as we age.
I read the other day, I'm not a huge soccer fan, but I read that the coach of Real Madrid, who's won 5 championships, he's 65. And his way of coaching is just sort of non-coaching. Whereas the younger coaches would be considered in their prime, like 35 or 40, are very sort of hands-on. There's a very sort of real methodology to it. And he or the people around him sort of attribute his style is to that he's older and it's not really the fashion to do what he does, but he doesn't really care.
Yeah.
He's like,
it's
I don't
working
care.
For him.
Yeah, this is just what works. So I'm going to do this.
Yeah. Dave, what that reminds me of is, so I have 2 high performance athletes. My boys are both big basketball players. And there's so many lessons I think sport can teach us about resiliency and well-being. And, one of the things I remember one of Hunter's coaches saying is that, he said so little during gameplay, and like other coaches would be like, some of them were getting technicals, like they were just spewing information at these young athletes. And when this coach was asked, like, why are you not really talking a lot on the bench? He said, they're not learning when they're playing. I'll cover this in practice, right? So he realized that when you are playing, I want them to think for themselves. I want to see what they know, what they do in those situations, and where there needs to be error detection and improvement, he would cover that in practice, because he said, this isn't the time. So again, I appreciate that there's trust, that you have that rapport with your team and your athletes of how do you make it, how do you really communicate the big ideas? And one of the things I know, again, as a parent of these 2, high performing athletes, is, they have to be able to think for themselves. And when we are rescuing and we are micromanaging the thought and the play and structure, we're actually taking away the opportunity for them to field test their ideas, trust their instincts, but also learn from their mistakes. Even just that ability, I think it was Alan Stein Jr. He's an amazing sports writer. And he said, I'm not worried if they take, a good shot or a great shot in basketball. I'm worried if they don't know why it was not a great shot, right? Like I want them to think it, like you need to be able to think it in real time. So yeah, I appreciate that reflection you shared.
I want to stay with this and sort of look at the 2. I find the whole sort of age slinky is getting sort of pulled apart. And there's an often comment about people who are younger versus I'm 65. So I was like, my God, like 50 years ago, it was a very different world.
Yeah.
And how younger kids now, they're not allegedly not as resilient. I don't really buy that, but because of the sort of like the helicopter parents, or not even the helicopter, the bulldozer parents,
yes,
like, doing everything for the kid. Yeah. But I think that my view on this is that it's different now. And this sort of like teenage, adolescent, young adult thing is getting stretched out. What used to be, maybe 4 years is now being stretched out to like 10 years. And I see it on the other end of the spectrum too. So people are living much longer now. So that's getting stretched out.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Absolutely right. And even in the research, we now call it emerging adulthood, because a 13-year-old is not the same as a 19-year-old. So we actually refer to that, 18 to 25 as emerging adulthood. Like we're not quite adults yet. Right. But which is so different, because for many of us, we grew up like 18 was that marker where we had to have our ducks in a row by 18 because it was a sink or swim situation. So you're absolutely right. And I'll share with you the 2 things that I've noticed working with youth. First of all, I have so much hope for the future because these kids are having conversations
Right.
and exploring big ideas like we never would have been doing decades ago, right? So I have a lot of hope for our adolescents. But the two things that I've noticed that are really creating barriers for resiliency for youth, number one is that they've kind of lost their threshold for frustration. And what I mean by that is these teenagers don't really manage frustration. So even for example, if they're trying to download a show and that particular streaming service has a 10-second delay, they won't wait, they'll jump to the next one, right? So they don't know how to sit with discomfort, that they just try to like find an alternative very quickly, where part of our ability to be resilient is to recognize that there's going to be some seasons and moments of discomfort, and how do we get okay with that discomfort? We don't have to like it, but we don't avoid or distract ourselves from that threshold of being upset or agitated, or again, frustrated is the big one. And I'm seeing that all the way from toddlerhood to teenagerhood, even some young adults, they don't like to feel frustrated. So I appreciate that. The second area that I've noticed, which is I think adding a barrier for our teenagers and resiliency, is that I don't think the way we're designed as humans that we're ever meant to know like everyone's opinion about everything. And because of how we are connected right now and just the exposure of what's happening in the world, it's just information overload for our young developing brains. So what happens is like, yeah, the world has been unwell for a very long time. Historically, we know this, but we weren't inundated with that messaging on this 24-hour news cycle. And what's happening now though is our kids aren't really getting a break from all of the unwellness in the world, which is again really contributing to mental health and emotional health for our younger generations.
I just want to say I identify with the frustration threshold of the teenager. I
Yeah.
share that.
Yes, I get that too. I totally get that.
Let's talk about the other end of the age spectrum.
Yeah.
The fastest growing group planet-wise is like people over 80
Yeah.
and 90s. And, this may or may not come true, but it seems like we're on a path to more people living healthier longer. That's not universal, but
Yes.
in what I can see is you're going to be having a comparatively first time in human history, a very large cohort of people over 90, maybe over 100.
Yeah.
How does that sort of fit in? I mean, because you mentioned this evolutionary perspective of purpose.
Yes.
And if 50 years ago, 75 was old.
Yes.
I'm 65. 65 would have been considered like time is short. I don't feel that way. So as we're moving further out here into a place where humans really, there haven't been any sort of substantial amount of people in these age groups, and this changing perspective, or I guess values sort of stay more or less the same, but purpose and perspective change. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a really beautiful question. And what I often think about is this idea that, when we think about like longevity, as a scholar, what I'm really curious about is the quality of those later years.
Mm.
So it's one thing to live really long. My question is are we living long well? Because I want to make sure that those, that last decade is in a place. And, I personally, when I think about myself as I'm aging, I want to make sure that that decade is I'm as functional as I possibly can, which means here for me at 45, I'm wildly mindful about brain health, because to me, that is going to be so crucial in that final season of my life. So the question, I think, when we think about how that connects to purpose, if I want to be able to be of service and to maintain my purpose and feel as if I can be useful and I'm contributing, something that I know is it's what I'm doing now at 45 that's going to be the greatest predictor of the quality and the purpose and the meaning, especially for women, especially to be maintaining our brain health, given that we know 2/3 of women in North America are being diagnosed with Alzheimer's. So again, when we think about our purpose and again, that connection and our resiliency, aging well is, to me, that's what it's really about. And for women especially, I think that's deeply connected to brain health.
This question fascinates me.
Yeah.
Because I see some people, Jimmy Buffett, who recently passed, he had a whole resort dedicated seemingly to dying quickly.
Yes.
Which I just don't understand. But okay, that seems to work for some people. But other people, I think the question comes up with what you're talking about is adherence.
Yes.
And how do you sort of stay on track, which requires a sense of purpose. And what I understood you to say was that your purpose was to maximize functionality, to be of service, to be useful, and
Yeah.
to have a meaningful later life.
Yes.
Does that sound right?
Yeah, absolutely. You echoed that perfectly.
So I'm sort of curious about the counter to that. Like, who doesn't want that? I don't understand that.
Oh, no, I get that. And it's amazing for some people. And again, because I have done work with trauma and grief, there
Mm,
are some people who carry such a heaviness because of their life experiences that
mm,
they want to be present, they want to do the good work, but they also get to a point, I think, David, where they're just like there's only so much that you can carry and give in a
mm,
lifespan. And again, especially for again, I see it a lot with trauma and grief where,
mm.
yes, they want to make the most of their years, but they also don't need to stay here any longer than they need to. And I have no judgment for that because I
Yeah,
haven't walked that path. I have
yeah.
never lost a child. I've never been in that situation. So again, I think, almost coming from a philosophical perspective, we're like, yeah, who wouldn't want to live well forever? Well, I think there's some people that, they get really tired and they get weary from the weight of the worlds that they carry. And so they want to be meaning makers and do the good work. And there's also a season when it's they're done. And that's that's every individual's choice. And I think that's why for so many and why there's this component about, with hope and how for some people it connects to their faith. And this gives them enormous
Mm.
amounts of encouragement and trust and confidence is because they trust that this is all going to work out and they'll see their loved ones again.
I say this all the time. In 1967, I was promised a flying car by the Jetsons.
Yes.
I don't have a flying car.
Yeah.
So a lot of this stuff about health and longevity, it's very easy for me to sort of slide into well, I don't have the flying car. So all this other stuff, I sort of lump with that. I could, I don't,
Yeah.
but
I
I could.
understand.
So it's this idea of trust. And I think everybody is doing sort of an ROI all the time. So what's the ROI on the pizza and donuts versus what's the ROI on maybe choosing a different behavior? I think that where this goes into the optimism trust thing is in the math, people will say, it's not worth it. This won't work for me.
Mhm.
I might work for these other people, but I'm not those people.
Mhm.
Or worse, which is the category I think that you mentioned earlier, I don't deserve this
Mhm.
for whatever reason. I think both of those things are very, very difficult. And I think back to, what was that guy's name? Shackleton, right? Him and like 120 guys. It was like 1880 and they crashed their boat in like Antarctica or someplace. And they had to walk and swim and all this stuff for all this insane amount of time. But he just trusted. It was like, okay, like we need to do this because if we don't do this, this other thing will definitely happen.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's also part of the human condition, which I actually love about the human condition. And, this kind of idea that we kind of live on these different ends of the continuum. So for
Yeah.
example, some days I wake up and I want to be super fiscally responsible and save for the future. And other days my mindset is I only live once, right? So buy the thing,
Yeah.
right? So it's literally this ping pong
Oscillation.
effect where
Yeah.
it's like, I am responsible and I'm going to save for the future and I'm going to do all the things my financial planner tells me to do. And then I might be standing there at the car dealership being like, I only live once, right? Like I think I've earned this, right? So, and what's really interesting about those, like that polarization, what we know is the more well-resourced we are in terms of like how well rested we are, how well fed we are, how well supported and seen and nurtured and cared for, it actually gives us more agency to
Right.
like kind of move through those different extremes
Yeah.
with just a little bit more ease. But when we're, example, in that chronic stress cycle, we just like, we're having though, it's hard to make good food choices because our body is so full of cortisol. One of
Yeah.
the quickest ways to metabolize cortisol is to eat carbohydrates.
Yep.
So at the end of the day, we curl up with white bread and then think life is worth living again, right? And we overcommit to eating lots of cookies and treats at nighttime because again, it's just that we're in these polaring, like these extremes. And again, there's no judgment. It's just really helpful to notice part of the human condition is that we do have that choice. We do get to kind of ebb and flow, which by the very definition of ebbing and flowing is nature. Like nature is always, it's our first teacher. It's always in this beautiful example of things coming and going and growing and receding. And again, just recognizing that our emotional health and our well-being and our wellness is very much a practice of nature as well.
Also cyclic. And
Yes.
yeah, what I tell people, they're like, well, how do we, live better, longer, happier? I said, go to sleep.
Yeah. 100%. And
Go to
on
sleep.
that note, oh my goodness, so often when I'm working with groups, they'll say, okay, Robyne, what diet, what supplement should I be taking? What's this? And then I will ask them, David, like, do you sleep? And they'll say, no. And I say, okay, well, you're stepping over $100 bills to pick up pennies
Yeah.
because you cannot do any type of supplementation that is going to replace
Yeah.
quality sleep and quality nap behavior.
Yeah.
So yeah, I totally echo that sentiment that the fundamentals, doing them correctly, will always give you your best return on your investment.
I've come to believe that, if you look at sort of the stuff that we talk about, like sleep and nutrition and stress management and community and all this stuff, if you're not sleeping, nothing else works.
No.
Nothing else matters. Like whatever you got to do, figure that out.
Yeah, and I can share with you from the sleep research, the reason, there's a couple of reasons why I feel like sleep sometimes gets like overlooked, but the greatest benefit. And I have found that when we educate people on this topic, it actually kind of helps them see the value add. And the big one is not just like the deep sleep and the REM sleep like everybody likes to talk about, but the N3 sleep, where what's actually happening is your brain decides, hey, this is me time now. And it will actually start that washing cycle. It's kind of like a dishwasher cycle. It'll wash out all of that, the adenosine and all of the toxins. And then you're getting like a fresh set of energy and hormones and functioning to be able to show up the next day with, which is so useful for us to be able to get those good sleep cycles. And, I often let folks know when you wake up and you're in that middle of that wash cycle, you feel groggy and kind of gross. So, how important it is that our brain is able to heal itself and do what it needs to do. And the other little takeaway that people seem to really attach to is the power of the nap. And we talk about nap in two different ways in my research. The one is the 20-minute nap if you need energy. Like if you need energy, just that 20-minute nap, you don't even have to sleep for the whole time. Just set a timer, monotask it, close your eyes. You'll probably fall asleep the last 3 or 4 minutes of it. No problem. Get up and go on your way. Now, the other nap, though, is if you feel heart tired, like you're emotionally tired, you're going to want a 90-minute nap. And what the research shows is after that full like cycle where you do a sleep cycle in 90 minutes, what the research shows is you're far more better at managing relationships. We have more compassion, we have more empathy, we're better communicators. We're also kinder to ourselves if we take that 90-minute nap for emotional recovery. So again, using those are going to give you a way better return on your investment than any type of supplement, because a supplement isn't replacement.
Let's intersect this with something else you said, which is humans are hardwired for struggle. And I think some people, well, like our Navy SEAL friends,
Yes.
they struggle a lot and they don't sleep a lot,
Yeah.
which is sort of part of their struggle. First, talk to me a little bit about this. We're hardwired for struggle. Where does that come from?
Yeah. So the notion that we're hardwired struggle is that we're very adaptable, right? We learn to adapt. Sometimes it could be maladaptive, but we will survive. Like that is the very nature of what we do, is we find ways to persist. It just might not be in the same type of quality of the experience that we're hoping for. And the reality is we can do difficult things and hard things, especially like in short seasons. Like we're not meant to constantly live in crisis. And I get nervous when people tell me, oh, Robyne, I thrive the best when I'm in chaos. And it's like, well, that's you've learned that this is where you thrive the best in chaos, but eventually it'll hit a point where your body's going to start to shut down, right? Like we're not meant to always be in that heightened state of arousal or what we call distress. So yes, we're hardwired for struggle. We will adapt. We'll find a way through. But the question is can we ensure that that hard struggle and the adaptive is more in a positive adaptive way than maladaptive? But we will always figure out, our survival rate is 100% as long as we're alive. So we'll always figure out ways to figure our way through it, but it's the quality of the experience that's going to be impacted.
From what you're saying, is there's sort of two kinds of stress. There's the acute, which is, okay, run up a mountain. Okay, that hurts.
Yeah.
But it was, short-lived. And then
Yes.
there's the chronic,
Yes.
which is that what you're talking about, that sort of endless stress, the cortisol,
Yeah.
this sort of stuff. The first one is, or we adapt. like you
Yeah.
said, because we do this acute stress, we become a little stronger because of it.
Yes.
Unless we do it constantly and then we crash. It's that chronic, being sort of in a chronic fight or flight state.
Mhm.
And I think we spoke a little bit about earlier in the conversation about how we need to have this sort of rest period
Yes.
here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And again, it's not that stress or the hormone cortisol is bad for us. It's the doses
Right.
of stress we get on a daily basis. So, yeah, training and, running that race or running up the hill. Yeah, absolutely. We're going to get stronger. We're going to develop this, adrenaline and cortisol will help us get through some of the hard points. But then we have this like almost like the sense of earned recovery, where it's like, I did that. So now I can rest. Where with the chronic stress, it could be like life circumstances, it could be economical pressures. Like there's so many of these constant like narratives where we're in that chronic stress cycle where everything feels urgent and the stress levels feel like relentless. Like we just don't get a break from it, which absolutely explains why people are, scrolling on their phones, just numbing themselves, because the reality is they're just looking for any type of relief, which then pushes people more towards the likelihood of those maladaptive strategies. Because the first example, the acute stressors, we tend to build in this kind of proactive approach, right? Like we train so that we get better, we fuel, we ice our sore joints, like we do this proactive approach. It's much harder when it's a chronic stress situation.
I spoke once with the behaviorist BJ Fogg,
Okay.
and
Wow.
he's really big on this idea of self-congratulation
Yes.
and the win. His thing is habit.
Yeah.
But I think that there's a Venn overlap of good habit and resiliency.
Yes.
And this idea of whatever you do that you feel good about. So you, as you said, like, what was my favorite David? Okay, when the favorite David arrives,
Yeah.
this is really silly, but it works. I take my right hand and I slap myself on
Yeah.
the shoulder and I say, good job.
Yeah.
And I feel it's like the silliest thing,
Yeah.
but it
It's
feels
amazing.
awesome. That's one of my sort of resiliency tricks.
This is the thing, the little things aren't that little after all. Like the little things are how we braid together strategies and resources and habits that allow us to be able to show up. And again, I think that's so important, that notion of like crossing finish lines. And when we look at, for example, like the rates of burnout and overwhelm in many persons right now, professionals, it's because there hasn't been any opportunity to celebrate the wins. It's been this chronic kind of keep going and do more with less, and just, we got to keep giving 110%, right? Whereas the reality is we have to have those markers where we're able to say, okay, I've gone to this point, celebrate it, cross that finish line, then recover, right? We know after somebody finishes that big thing, they're going to do active recovery. And I often look at, for example, when I'm working with high performance athletes, and the question came up recently where I was being interviewed and somebody asked me like, okay, Robyne, what's your typical day? And I shared it with them. And then the woman said to me, wow, you must feel so guilty that you spend so much time looking after yourself when you have like kids and family and work. Like, don't you feel guilty being away from your kids? And I didn't even like hesitate. And I responded, I said, no, I feel guilty if I yell at my kids because
Yeah,
I haven't looked after myself. I feel guilty if I'm short with my husband because I haven't taken
right.
the time to do the things that I know put me in a better position where I'm able to respond versus react. And so this thing about guilt got me really curious. And I was talking to this, an Olympic athlete, and I said, after you train, do you feel guilty if you like ice your joints or you're taking anti-inflammatory or doing massage or soft tissue? And they looked at me like I was crazy. And they're like, no, I don't feel guilty. Because he said, Robyne, my recovery is part of high performance.
Right.
So like he built in time of the high performance, that recovery is part of excellence. And I just think we need to adopt and maybe borrow that approach from the sport world and bring it over to corporate, because I think if we thought of our recovery as part of high
Yeah,
performance, it would radically change how people look after themselves.
I agree with that 100%. I
Yeah.
also think that we need to self-congratulate and recognize the smaller incremental things
Yeah.
that we do well. And maybe it's just something as simple as like I made my bed, or
Yeah.
like, hey, it was raining today, but I got to work on time. Okay,
Yeah.
good job. Because I think we keep that bar like the gold medal or the president calls us up or something. Like, okay, there's like a dozen different opportunities during the day where we actually exhibited some excellence, and we actually showed up and did what we were really good at. And to acknowledge that rather than that constant negativity bias of like, well, I
Yeah.
could have done better. Well,
Yeah. David, I really appreciate this because, again, I think this ties back to what we're talking about of us being afraid of our own greatness.
yeah,
And one of
exactly.
the things that I've learned about is, I have a very close friend, and we created this kind of practice where we talk about it as like the brag hotline, where it's like, I'm allowed to tell you a big win or something really cool that's happened to my family, me, my kids, professionally, doesn't matter what it is. And I don't have to preface it by saying, I'm really grateful for this. And, I know this is a blessing and I know I have privilege. Like, I'm allowed to just be excited and like share my good news without feeling like I have to like buffer it with all of those social pleasantries that we've been conditioned. And yes, that's part of civility, right? We don't just want to walk around talking about, oh, I'm the best in the world and all of these things. But being able to have like one conduit where you're able to share, like outside of your partner, like outside of kind of your immediate family, to be like, hey, I just landed this huge contract and this is so cool. And not feeling guilty, not feeling like, oh, I should be coming across as braggy. And having that little bit of a brag hotline, I think actually is even more powerful than even writing it down for ourselves. Because what we're doing is like we're taking the invisible and we're making it visible, and like the invisible making it visible, and we're sharing it with a trusted community member. And again, to me, that's making the win that much more visible in that safe lane,
Right.
where I think it's really good that we share that.
100%. We can be our own best cheerleaders or our own worst, or the opposite
Yeah.
of that is.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And one of the gentle kind of little takeaway when I'm working with people about that inner critic and that being really hard on ourselves is I know a practice that works really well for me, similar to what you described as like, you're like, hey, you're doing good work, and you congratulate yourself with the shoulder tap. One of my little takeaways is I don't really trust anything my brain comes up with after 8 p.m. Right? Like whatever I think after 8 p.m., I'm like, no, this is like the most depleted energy source. My adenosine is through the roof. I don't really believe anything I think after 8 p.m. because I notice for me that negative kind of inner gremlin kind of seems to come out at nighttime. So by just the practice of I don't really trust anything that comes out after 8 p.m., my morning energy it has better clarity, and I'm kinder to myself in the morning. Little things like that. Again, the little things aren't that little after all.
No, they're not. No. If somebody wants to get in touch with you, Robyne, what would they do?
Yeah, the best way to reach out is through social. Dr. Robyne on all the social channels, or my website. It's at drrobyne.ca. And again, I would love to keep this conversation going with anyone who's curious about this information, and to just be able to be of service and be helpful however I can.
Super. It's been a pleasure speaking with you today. I appreciate your time. I know you're busy, and I think resilience is probably the topic of the next decade.
Agreed. Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, thank you for making space for this, David. I appreciate it. Take good care.
my pleasure. Bye now.